Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our museum members, our audience tuning in online, and I encourage any of you who use social media to share your experiences here tonight using the hashtag 9/11MuseumTalk. I'm Jessica Chen. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the museum, and I'd also like to take one more second to ask everyone to silence all of your electronic devices. On July 22nd, 2011, at 3:25 p.m., a car bomb exploded in the government center in Oslo. Later that same day, beginning around 5:21 p.m., a massacre began on Utøya Island. In total, 77 Norwegians were murdered by a single terrorist. Most of those killed were teenagers attending the Norwegian Labour Party's annual youth camp. Like the 9/11 attacks for America, the July 22nd attacks for Norway were devastating, and nevertheless a part of Norwegian history that needed to be remembered. Only 4 years later, the 22nd of July Center opened as a place to learn and reflect on what happened that day. And tonight we are joined by historian Tor Einar Fagerland and architect Atle Aas to discuss the work of creating 2 memorial sites to commemorate this national tragedy. Tor Einar Fagerland is head of department and associate professor of history at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Since 2012, he has led the research project July 2nd and the negotiation of memory. In 2015, Tor was chief curator and project manager for the 22nd of July Center in Oslo. He has served as special advisor for the Norwegian Labour Youth League and is currently a special advisor for the 22nd of July Center and the Norwegian Ministry of Local Government and Modernization. Atle Aas is an architect and a member of the exhibition working group for the 22nd of July Center in Oslo. Together with Tor, Atle was also created the historic exhibition Heimhuset, a memorial and learning center surrounding and protecting preserved parts of the cafe building on Utøya Island. Heimhuset opened in 2011. We are grateful to the Norwegian Consulate in New York's generous support of tonight's program, which will be moderated by 9/11 Memorial Executive Vice President and Deputy Director of Museum Programs, Clifford Channon. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Tor, Atle, and Cliff.
Thank you, Jessica. Welcome, everybody. Gentlemen, welcome. I want to add a word of my own to the introduction because this subject matter is something that brought me and Alice Greenwald, who unfortunately can't be here tonight, James Young sitting just over there, into a direct relationship with. And it's something that we have observed up close, having been asked by our colleagues here and some of the other Norwegians who are involved, simply to listen and observe and try to find some connections between what we had already gone through here in creating and working on the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, and what in Norway they were facing for, in effect, the first time. And it was an extraordinary privilege to be even a peripheral part of that, but certainly to see up close what the work was, and just to see from close, but nonetheless outside, another society as it was trying to come to terms in a much narrower time frame than even we had here at the 9/11 Museum and Memorial. In this much narrower time frame, trying to translate this overwhelming flood of sadness and emotion into physical places and into a narrative response. And it was a very moving experience. I made 3 trips in the course of 18 months, and I don't think that was unusual in relation to what the travel was for my colleagues from the US going over there. But it really sort of cemented very much in my thinking this idea that those of us who, for whatever reason, are brought in to these kinds of projects are sharing a common experience and are beginning to try to speak in a common language with a common grammar and common references, and sort of doing this as it is developing. It's not that this is fixed and known in advance. It's that doing this is the way that the language and the understandings are developed. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to do here in the context of our own country and being part of the response, and then to go to Norway and, again, with some measure of distance, not really knowing much about Norway before I was involved anyway, that nonetheless it's extraordinarily familiar, and yet there is just a slight degree of distance that at times I think turned out to be useful for the process. That's sort of the most I would say on our behalf. It was much more the privilege on our side to be part of this. So I'm particularly pleased and particularly moved to welcome Tor Einar and Atle for this evening's program, because I'll give you the punchline before the end of the joke, and it's not a joke, but it's an extraordinary accomplishment what they did there in an extraordinarily short amount of time. And not being able to comment as much on Norwegian history, I can certainly comment on what time frame means to this kind of project. And they managed something in an extraordinarily fast time. So I want to talk about the general sort of situation that you each found yourselves in as you were brought into this project. You're both Norwegian, you're both part of the national mourning, but also there is, and this is what brings you into the activity, there is this sense in the country that this needs to be memorialized, and it needs to be memorialized in a formal way. So I'd like to start there and ask each of you to talk about what you think brought you into the project. Certainly it was the government and the Labour Youth Party those were the two driving forces behind the different memorials. And we'll talk about the different memorials, but I'm really wanting to talk more about the broad themes than about so much the specifics of the places. What was it to be brought into this? What was the feeling that you had as Norwegians who were affected by this, like all of your countrymen, and yet having a certain professional, even distanced demand put on you to think about how the country could respond formally?
I can start. Being an historian, but also a Norwegian, I kind of had this. I was affected in a double way, because together with Atle, we had been working on memorial issues before, connected with mostly World War II memorials. And when July 22nd happened, it felt like the right thing to do, to try to help in a way. And my approach into it was, I saw myself to start with foremost as a researcher. So I set up this project at our university to document and analyze all these projects, because the memorialization, just as it did here, started very early with the spontaneous memorials, and then there was this urge and almost demand from the public that this needs to be remembered, and it became formalized very quickly, through different processes. And my idea was, as I said, to be a researcher. But then, as it turned out, I became much more hands-on involved, first as an advisor, and then as an actually practitioner, being part of memorial projects. First at Utøya, and then together with Atle in the government center.
Atle, you, as an architect, have, of course, a different relationship to the event. This was an actual event that took place. I'm speaking now in particular about the government center, which was the beginning of the attack with a truck bomb. How did you come into this, and what did you bring as an architect to that process?
Well, as Tor Einar said, we had worked on related projects before, and I had, I had a distance to the theme and a very closeness to the theme. By familiarity with my son having been at Utøya the years before, and I thought I found it very, very difficult to cope with. So sort of throwing myself and saying yes to this project was very important to me personally, to sort of deal with it in a way, even though I wasn't harmed or nobody in my family were harmed by the attacks. But I realized when I said yes to it, it was something that I had, kept a distance to. And of course, being asked to go do an intervention on a site as such, so important in so many ways, not the least as the high-rise building, this government center, is a sort of a symbol of our nation. It has always been since it was put up in '58. It was with great sort of respect for what the idea that had brought that building up in the first place, and of course also how do you do this, with the constraints in time and finances, etc. That you and it was. I think for both of us, I mean, it was, first of all, we had to sort of deal respectfully with the relatives, the people. We set up a meeting, we discussed at great lengths with the relatives and the survivors. Well, the importance of the site was the second thing, and then the site being so rich in a way. I mean, so full of, it was a scarred site. It was a ruin in a way. It was so rich in surface. It was how much do you really need to add to a site like that? It was so, to me, so it had so much story in it. Mm-hmm.
And of course, as Atle said, it's and you also, the time frame here is so important, because although having been working on memorial issues before, this was something completely different, because working on maybe even difficult topics related to World War II is kind of scratching in something that is...
It's the past.
It's the past. It's the past. Here the wounds are wide open, and this closeness that we kind of were not prepared for with the victim families, the survivors, gave challenges but also a richness to our work.
One of the things you mentioned, and I am fascinated by it in general because we experienced it here. You experienced it in Norway. We heard a report from an Australian. There was a terrorist attack in a cafe in Sydney, Australia, and as that was reported live in Australia, they were actually speculating on what memorial would be made before the attack was actually over. So what is it, you encountered this so directly, what is it about the public expectation that, you mentioned this earlier, the public expectation that a memorial be built for these things? That is different, very materially, than it would have been 40 or 50 years ago. And certainly the time process by which a memorial is conceptualized and created also would have happened over a much longer time span. What were you wrestling with in Norway with the idea that this really needed to be done now?
This is what you're saying is completely true. You see it, you saw it here. We definitely saw it I've seen it in Norway, and I have no full explanation, but maybe it at least partly has to do with the media situation, that it's so close up, and you kind of cannot. It's hard to avoid it. It's hard to escape it, and then that, in some sense, creates some kind of urgency that this needs to be dealt with, and that seemed to be kind of a shared sentiment both among those directly affected and among the general public.
And one knows that it can bring some sort of you know, it can take some pain away to be in a good space. That sort of it can be healing in a way.
In this sense, the public response in Norway was actually anticipating many of these things, because there were demonstrations of solidarity and mourning across the country in cities large and small. This became very much a national response. So I'm wondering in some ways whether or not the speed of the official response was a way of trying to keep up with what the society itself seemed to be expressing quite spontaneously.
I think that's true. I mean, it was a national tragedy, you know, in of course, but particularly because this was a youth camp, you know, people coming from all across the nation, you know, so it affected all local communities.
What you see here is this is the new government center when it was new in 1958. Norway being a social democratic, peaceful society up north, kind of sheltered. And if we take picture 2, yes, here at Utøya, the other site. Also a peaceful setting, but an important setting, because this is an important place for the Norwegian Labour Party, and having this annual summer camps for the youth organization for 70 years. And so this is very this is 2010, and these youngsters coming from all over Norway. So in a double sense, the whole of Norway was attacked. First our government center, and then youngsters from all over the place. Each and every district was affected.
We do have a slide of the government center after the bombing, so you can see.
Yeah, this is minutes after.
That is
the same building, but a completely different setting.
And you know, there's a map that will show the trajectory of the attack. Many of you will know, but just for the sake of background, can you just describe briefly the sequence of the attack, and then we can talk about a little bit more about the localities.
The attack was at 1523. This is, of course, the central Oslo, in the Oslo fjord, and the
red is the explosion.
That's right. And immediately afterwards, the perpetrator rushed into his car, escape vehicle, and started driving towards Utøya, which is on the left. You can see it's a small dot there. It's the island in the lake, and he came to the land side 1626, so approximately an hour ago, an hour after. He had to sort of do a little detour because there were some road works, and so you know we have been working on those two sites basically. You know, this is
it's a
geography of the attack.
A bomb site in the capital, and then the massacre on the island, where he got access to the island dressed as a police officer, which in a way now sounds a bit naive, allowing him into the island, but this is Norway pre-terrorism.
Yeah. It's funny because you can now look back on the expectations you had of what the world was like pre the attack, and even doing that, you see just how far away those expectations now are. You no longer have that set of expectations. And just to give a detail, the bomb itself, which did enormous physical damage to the government center site, killed 8 people. The vast majority of the killing was of the young people on the island for this summer camp. 69 of them were killed, most, as I understand, shot at close range. So 77 people in all, which, just by point of comparison, per capita, is a larger loss of life for Norway than 9/11 was for the United States. So it gives you another sense of the scale of what this was.
And also, Cliff, now terrorism has come. It's become a European thing, even in Western Europe, Manchester now. But in 2011, that was the first this event, at least in this part of Europe, for a very, very long time. So Norway was kind of an Oklahoma City before 1995. In a way, it was kind of a sheltered society, far from a lot of things going on elsewhere. So the impact of the event was huge.
Yeah. Now, there are two separate memorial tracks going off of this event, one to take place on the island and around the island, the other to take place at the government center, which is where the 22nd of July Center currently exists. But take us back to sort of the guiding principles of what you thought you had to do as you became involved in these projects. What was the shaping thought or thoughts that guided you in the decision making?
Well, if we start at Utøya, I was asked by the labor youth in 2013 to be a conversation partner, because very early after the event, the labor youths were very committed to saying that we're going back to our island because the terrorists did a lot of harm, but he shall not take away our island, our home in a way. But they did their way of coming back, they felt, was that they needed to somehow get rid of the evil, meaning that they had to tear down and remove stuff directly affected with the massacre in order to allow for new life.
So slide 6 would be showing the...
that is, and then you had families thinking that, victim families saying that this was wrong, and they just didn't know that there was no way forward, and it became a very complex situation. And this picture is from 2013, and you see it's still a deserted island. There's no campers, there's no tents, only an empty island, and they didn't know a way forward.
So this is the so-called cafe building.
This is the
on the
cafe
island,
building.
which was kind of the center of the social life.
It was the center of the social life, and it's centrally located on the island. And this was, of course...
Yeah, and if you can take picture 7.
The next picture,
And here's the inside, and the labor youths 13 young people was murdered here, and they thought that this kind of house of horror could not, so close to the campsite, it couldn't work together. And they knew that we knew something about how this has been dealt with elsewhere. So what we did was to set up this group that you have already mentioned with James, Ed Lilienthal, Alice Greenwald, and you. And so what we did was to kind of create an open space to discuss how do we find the balance, allowing for both memory and new life, like the discussions you had here.
So I want to point out here that on the one hand, you have the previous picture of the cafe building representing for the young people this idea that this must be taken away so that they can go forward. But you see here the flowers on the floor, you see holes in the wall. Those are the bullet holes from where some of the 13 young people in that building were murdered. So this is the tension of trying to manage a process. And there was, fortunately, a solution to this tension.
Yeah, and to put a long story short, what we suggested was to keep the most important part of the spaces the most directly affected, both the sites of the deaths, but also the sites of survival, because many it was also a hiding place.
Right.
And so what this solution achieved was to create. It opened up a space where we could tell the story of what happened that day. We could use the site where it happened to tell what happened. So thereby, these spaces being regarded as a problem, an obstacle for getting back, it actually became part of the solution.
So if you go to slide 18, you've actually got, what happened was you cut off
Yeah.
the relevant parts of the building to save them and removed the other parts of the
That's
building
right.
and built a structure around them.
We made, as you said, we saved the parts of the cafe building that where the killings happened, and we made a protective building around it, so we can contain the pain in a way, you know, and allowing all the other things that you do on a summer camp or a political camp to go on around it, but still sort of not, you know, it's still there, you know,
Yeah.
but within the protective building. And this is, you recognize, of course, parts of the cafe building, and underneath there is a learning center, basically for classes coming. It's, they have quite good resources, you know, they do workshops, they do different kind of classes, and it's sort of like a, you know, it's a blank canvas in a way there, even today, but so the youths are sort of working on these walls and in that room and trying together to sort of find ways to understand it and deal with it in their own life. And so that's what goes on in the space you see.
And if you can take slide 17,
Yeah.
there you see it from the outside, and you also see that the campers and the tents are back.
Yeah.
And you see this protective
Protective.
building with 500 or something pillars represented each one of the survivors from that day.
Yeah.
And within that, there are 69 pillars representing the dead ones. And the families, they really loved that symbolism.
Yeah.
And so this is creating a space for telling the story, but also it was also a way of re-establishing the trust between the labor youths and the victim families. So it came together in a good way.
I will say I was there last summer when the island was returned to the labor youth, when the building was opened to the visitors for the first time. There was something that you worked long and hard with great difficulty to decide about, and let's look at slide number 19, because telling the story, and this is a story of technology as well, the wall that depicts the chronology of the event on the island actually incorporates text messages from the children on the island to their families or loved ones off the island, which was a very difficult decision to try to use.
We had, you know, this. We had, of course, the year before made the timeline. We had worked with the timeline, the theme in the 22nd of July Center, and this was, of course, in a totally different site, but sort of dealing with the same, of course, the same day. But here we sort of we had the possibility and the wish to make it more personal and we approached the families and we were allowed to use text messages from, you know, this was a big theme on Utøya Island, because as the youths were hunted down by the killer, a lot of them call their families, friends, and each other, to check on each other. And so this timeline, it has a sort of a the central line tells the story about a very sort of factual description of what's happening, and you see the text messages are, placed correctly along the timeline, and it's very personal.
It's
and
very personal.
It's very different than the timeline we made at the 22nd of July, which was a sort of the big picture. This
Right. This
right
is much more
into-
intimate, much more intimate. Yeah.
But if I could add something there, because it was Atle's idea to shouldn't we use these text messages that we knew existed but hadn't been made public, because that was the lifeline with those on the island and those on the mainland for over an hour when the massacre took place on different parts on the island, and of course asking the survivors, asking families to give us these messages. It was we knew that when we did it, we took on a huge responsibility. And we had a meeting with them all, and they said yes, they would think about it, and then they came back, they said they wanted to participate in this. And what we knew was that each family or person giving us something, and we knew that we couldn't use all we got because we got a lot. But we needed to use at least something from each and every one. We could not say that your story is not important enough. So, and that, of course, made it a challenge to get it right, but we did it. But
The next slide shows the young people gathering during the opening to look at that. And I will say the method you used is very, very low-key, very sober, but it does indicate which of the messages were answered from parents by children and which were not because the children couldn't answer. So in a very powerful but understated way, you do get the sense of what the fate of the people sending these messages was.
And earlier you saw these rooms that we have now protected, where there are shrines, family shrines, etc. And we were discussing a lot, what can we add to such a space, if anything, because it's such intimate spaces. And then we came up with these text messages which we think resembles the same type of intimacy. So that wall is the only thing we added to those spaces that we have kept.
So you go through this room before you enter into the kept or the preserved part of the cafe building.
There is also a memorial on the island itself for the victims, which conveys their names. That was also, I guess, a place that would be the centerpiece of family visits to the island.
That's right.
I think we have a slide of that, but I can't find the number. Let's talk, though, about the public response, both to the memorial on Utøya, but also because it's more accessible to the Norwegian public and to visitors to Norway, I should add, the 22nd July Center in the heart of Oslo. We spoke before about this massive popular response across the country. But now that these memorials have been formalized, what has been the response of the public to being able to go to a place and have this kind of a place to make this more formal gesture?
Could we take slide 8? So this is back to the government center.
Back to the government center.
And this is the day before the opening of the center on the fourth anniversary.
And that's a shroud on the building, I should point out. It's just a cover of the disaster.
This is the other side from where we have seen it before. This is a sort of a tarp put up by the government to sort of hide the ruin. As you see, the sky is always blue there in the windows.
And the government center is at the base of that building. If you look at the bottom, it will be on the right. You can see that little white panel, and that is actually the entrance to the 22nd July Center.
That's right. And what you see to the right of that entrance is the Western Pavilion, which was the pavilion or the space we were originally given to make an information center. I went down there 6 months or so before the opening to inspect the space, and I started walking, further in underneath the high-rise building, because this is all connected, towards the east, and I saw these rooms, really damaged, and I realized if we are to tell the story, it has to be here. It has to be as close as possible to the where it all started physically, which is on the back of this building, of course.
Was there resistance to the idea of using these damaged spaces?
There was, there were some practical things because, they were not secure, etc. And of course we weren't, 6 months is 6 months, and the budget was basically, given. So it was a matter of trying to get it done within those requirements. But we used quite a lot of time to explain to them what the value actually was of those surfaces, of those spaces, because the Western Pavilion was 400 square meters, and the area where we proposed to make the exhibition is about 1,200 or so. So it's a much larger area, but it's a sort of a landscape, and it could sort of, give the visitors some closeness, some distance. You could sort of. Yeah.
But just to add that this was actually quite a controversial project because we were not. This was not only a commemorative project; it was also about telling the story of that day. And in order to tell that story, there is a perpetrator involved, and just as you had it here, how to deal with Bin Laden, how do we deal with our own homegrown right-wing extremists?
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of controversies there, and there were Facebook groups with 15,000 members saying no to a Breivik museum. Breivik is the name of the terrorist, and because there was this speculations about
there were rumors that
a lot of rumors.
it would be dedicated to him, so to speak.
So there was a lot of turmoil, which you noticed because you attended the opening. But what kind of made this work in a way was that the trust with the families, with the labor youths, was already established because we have been on the island with them for more than a year when we started this project. So and maybe Atle would show a bit about what's inside the.
Slide 10 would show the damage. I think you get a picture of some of the damage of the spaces.
That's right.
So you can see the walls and the ceiling here, and this is close to the beginning of the exhibition.
This is right after what we call the memory room, which is the room where all the photos of the dead are, and this is the prologue. Yeah, that's right. This is sort of on the side. You can choose if you want to go in there or not, but you can. There are some blank spaces still. There were not all the relatives wanted to give a picture.
I wanted to focus on that for a moment because it's also the evolution of the trust as well.
That's right.
You opened with I don't remember
I
the
think
number.
7 blank spaces.
A certain number missing. And when some of the families then came and saw the center, it was at that point, and it comes back to your point about trust, it was at that point that they said, okay, we now give you permission to add the photo
That's right.
of our loved one.
That's right. I think, a lot of people rightly felt, why, the government that should have protected my child, now they want the picture. It was that kind of feeling for some of them, maybe. But more pictures have come, so now I think it's only 2 or 3 that's blank.
And we also know that, of course, this is a public space, and we all go there to commemorate, but we also know that some families use this space on their children's birthday, for instance. So, yeah.
We see something similar here at the memorial or in our memorial exhibition. But I think, as in our case, this is really the heart of the center. You have it first. It's certainly a separate space as we have. As you might imagine, with so many of the victims being children, it's extremely powerful to walk in there and see these, lovely, diverse, mostly young faces, but all of them just taken for absolutely no reason, but very deliberately at the same time. Let's come to the story of the Breivik Museum, as the accusation was, because, again, you are so close to the event. The trial has occurred, but the trial also is a very painful process for Norway. You have to tell the story. You're absolutely right, Tor Einar, that we are very familiar with the trajectory of this kind of thing, but you're doing it so much more quickly than we did. Talk a bit more about what it was that you wanted to do, that you were accused of doing, and that you wound up showing as by way of depicting the historical narrative of this event, including the trial and conviction of the perpetrator.
Okay. If we could take picture 13 or 12, maybe 12. There's this timeline, 18 meters, documenting the story of that day. We wanted to do it in a very documentary way, showing in a very precise way that this actually happened to real people in real places. Therefore, it was so important for us using the actual site, like we did at Utøya. So these projects are actually twin projects, using the sites to tell the story of what happened right where it happened. And so and we use objects, texts, photos, directly connected with the event, and we choose not to write any exhibition text ourselves. Instead, we used kind of paragraphs from the word or the judgment. So it's
the judgment of the court on Breivik.
Yes. Which it's a long text, more than 100 pages, and it was read out directly on TV and radio. It took 8 hours on 24th of August 2012, and we use parts of that both as a way in a way they are exhibition text, but they are also objects directly connected with the event. Is there any slide, Atle, you would want to?
Well, we could go back to the one you had from the prologue room, the 10 maybe. Yeah, that's the first judgment text you meet in the center. So as you walk around, it's a circular movement. It's chronological. You meet those documents, so to speak, at certain intervals relating to what we are actually showing in the exhibition. And they are, with the exhibition, it's not sort of like us being the creators. I mean, we are editors. We have amassed some documents, some objects, some images, some experiences, and we're trying to sort of make sense of it all, and not sort of putting ourselves, not our words, anywhere, So it's sort of that's an underlying idea, I think, us as editors, not creators. And what you see here is, of course, the line between those two things are hard to see sometimes.
Right.
But we have on the left you have a loop going of. We got hold of all the surveillance videos. Of course, this was a government center, so there was quite a lot of surveillance video, and we edited this down to a few minutes, I think, showing the car coming, parking, time going. He getting out of his car, taking off to Utøya, and then the explosion.
So and we do believe that most Norwegian can tell exactly where they were and what they were doing that day when they heard about the event. And what we have recreated in a way is these hours as a physical walk. And for instance, these texts, this is the first text, is kind of a summary of it all. And when you walk to the spaces where we deal with what happened in the government center, you get a more detailed text from that event, and then further on to Utøya.
And then, of course, when you're standing there and looking at those surveillance videos, you're actually standing about 4 meters away from where the actual bomb was that day.
In this photo, you see a little window. I think you were going to point that out.
That's right. You come out from the left there, from the prologue room, which we've just been to, and you have a little window to sort of. You look out at the space where it actually happened, and you can't see anything there, but you sense that's where it is, and it sort of reorients yourself. You're sort of in touch with the world out there, and you see the new government center coming up, and it's but that's the only window or only possibility of looking out in a way, and so you see that wall is a sort of very cinematic sequence of images taken by a person who was one of the first ones at the site. He sort of walked in a daze towards the explosion and shot on, automatic. And it's a sort of a very moving 15 pictures, I think, showing him getting close or being drawn towards where the actual explosion was.
And if you can take slide 13.
Yeah. That is the other side of the room, which this exhibition is at the government center, but of course the tragedy is at Utøya in even greater scale, and this is an image of Utøya, a small island in a big lake. At Utøya we tell the story of what happened at Utøya.
Right.
But this is the government center, so we need to tell the full story. And we remember discussing, well, of course we can tell the story of the bombing here because this is the site, but how to tell the story of what happened on an island like that in such an urban setting, such an urban landscape, which this room is. And then Atle said we need a photo of Utøya, and it needs to be big. So we have made it.
And it's a beautiful photo. I mean, it's a beautiful scene. It's a beautiful,
yeah.
And I do want to point out again, the room itself is just filled with the damage of the explosion.
That's right. This is it is. And then you see the poles there are not from us. It's put up there to sort of stabilize the building, which was heavily damaged, of course. And you see the car wreck, and on the left you have the timeline connecting, the government center and Utøya.
And it's such it was only 3 hours, but it's still a many-layered story. And for instance, this photo of Utøya have that dimension to it because it's taken at 10:30 in the evening. Seemingly everything has calmed down. The perpetrator is arrested and everything, but still all the 69s are still on the island with white blankets over them. There are still policemen searching for more possible perpetrators. The perpetrator are still on the island being interrogated. So it has all these. This room is those 3 hours as best as we could tell it with all these layers.
I'm wondering, you look back now, and I know you're both still involved in ongoing discussions and further developments of the projects, but what was a shared vocabulary that you created, shared with others, whether us here or other memorial sites, and what was specifically Norwegian about what you did? Do you have a sense of that yet in terms of looking back at your work?
Well, there's both, but for us, being part of this larger international family dealing with these events, that is a huge part of it. And I remember when we set up this group and we met with the labor youth on the island, James Young told this, he put it in this way, that we're not here to tell you what to do, we're here to keep you company.
Yeah.
And we did. And you kept us company. And this week there are staff members from the center being here at the museum, learning and discussing. So that is a huge part of it, as kind of a shared thing. We don't have this kind of thinking about the Norwegian thing. I remember James, Alice, and Ed thinking about how do you deal with are there different types of victims here, and of course there are those who was murdered for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but there are also those who was murdered trying to save the life of others. And you have first responders on the islands, etc. In Norwegian culture, it was hard to finding a way of dealing with that type of thing, because we are quite an equality-oriented society. So basically, we don't separate. Although there are some small things now, because, for instance, at Utøya, in one of the new buildings, the cafe is called Monica, which was one of the first responders, because she was a grown-up there to take care of the young.
Who was murdered? One of the first people.
Yeah,
killed.
she was the second one to be murdered. Yeah.
Atle, you have a sense of the balance between the international exchange on this and the Norwegian-ness of what you did?
Well, I think it's difficult to put into words for me, but I you know, it's a sort of a sparseness to it. It's a cleanliness to it in a way. It's a sort of clean approach. It's respect for the surfaces and the materials. I don't know. I mean, but that is yeah.
Well,
I mean, it has some sort of qualities that I feel are inherently Norwegian, but yes.
I remember while working in the center, and there's this Norwegian poet who once said that about the largest things you should use the smallest words. And that is kind of an approach that we have attempted to do, because the story in itself and the stories of those coming into the center or coming to Utøya, they have so much baggage with them. So we try to allow for them not using any big. For instance, we had a lot of live films that and sounds, etc., that we could have shown, but we choose not to. And if we go to slide 15, what we call the witness room, there's this girl here called Hanne. She's sitting in the cafe building, telling her stories and how she was shot 4 times, and her best friend was murdered right next to her. And this is actually the only place in the exhibition that there are sound. The only ones who are allowed to speak are the survivors. So that is there is this calmness and restraint in
Yes, which might be typically Norwegian or Scandinavian, but you can sort of, and you can hear the voices of the witnesses throughout the space. It's quite.
It does filter out.
It's quite moving, and you come in there and you hear the actual words, and you're of course shocked by them. You know.
How did you feel the responsibility, and I think about what we did here in the same context, of now being responsible for telling a part of your country's history? I mean, it's not something you set out to do necessarily if you're an historian, certainly not your contemporary history, but what was that? How did that feel?
Well, as an historian, I have been asked a couple of times, is this center, is it telling the national history of July 22nd? And as you have seen, there are actually many stories of July 22nd also in the center. So what I'm saying is, I don't think so, but I do think that we have created a national space to talk about the July 22nd.
Yeah. This is when you come out of the witness room, you come into the aftermath, so to speak.
And this is the area where the trial is described, and on the left you see a section devoted to the national memorials, the spontaneous memorial. Yeah.
And then you're faced with the final judgment. You can't escape it. It's sort of right in the middle there.
How has attendance been? How have people used this? What's the public response been? Particularly, I'm focused on the July 22nd Center because it's in the heart of the city and it's accessible to anyone who wants to go there.
And the numbers of visitors has been much higher than expected. The first summer, there were long lines each and every day. People wanted to get in, and that first year it was one of the most visited sites in Norway. Nowadays is still very well visited, but it has kind of turned towards education and school classes coming in, and there's on average 1 to 2 school classes each day, and that is about as much as it takes, and the staff are doing a wonderful job. But it's a different visitor pattern now than it was to start with.
But this is of course the only national center dealing with 22nd of July in Norway. What you've seen from Utøya is on a private island, so to speak. It's not accessible for the public in general.
Not to the same amount that
Right. And just in terms of the education part, what's extraordinary is, so we're now 5 coming on 6 years away, and it happened so quickly that the generation of students, the young ones don't remember already, imagine that. And within a couple of years, no one who's in middle or high school is going to remember it. We see it now 15 plus years after 9/11. Nobody through high school, practically through college, has their own memory of 9/11. So time, as the cliche goes, passes very quickly. Let's see if we have any questions from our audience here. Raise your hand if you do. Sir, just wait for the microphone to come to you, right behind you.
Yes, I'm struck by one, excuse me, by one thing that I did not hear from you. You've alluded to some differences of vision about what should be included and what should happen to the spaces and so forth. But in contrast to our own experience, you have not alluded to differences of political interpretation. For example, I'm wondering if teachers are bringing school children to this event, they have to answer the question, well, why did he do that? And that immediately generates a hot potato. Do you then present the perpetrator's ideas and propagate them in a way, or do you come up with some other response? So I'm just curious if there was a debate around that in your country.
In general, there is a debate, has been a debate, and the baseline is that the political left treat it like political terrorism, while the political right tends more to treat it like a kind of act of a single madman. It was just something that happened. And to put it in a very black and white, and there's a lot of things in the middle. How we treat it in the center is the same way as we treat all the other aspects, by using documents directly affected because the verdict, the judgment text, that deals with his motives as he puts them himself, and we have a section about that, not going into much detail, but then again we don't go into much detail at all, because it's an overview of a thing. But so it's kind of we don't tell the full story of July 22nd in that center. It's kind of we like to think of it just as much as a starting point to further debate, further investigation, further discussions, and we do have a separate space where both ordinary visitors and school classes are taking afterwards to elaborate and put it into a more contemporary context, and how should this affect us today and in the future. So.
Yeah, if our program, or if our experience here is any guide, and I know the colleagues from Norway are here working on exactly this, it's through the education programs and the things that you do in interacting with your visitors that these debates are held. It's a very different matter to fix it on a wall, because it gets out of date very quickly no matter what you put on a wall.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the Western Pavilion, which we looked at earlier, which was meant to be the original site of the exhibition, is dedicated to that sort of research and that sort of discussions with students, with people in general.
One
Talks.
more?
Yeah.
One more? Please, just wait for the mic.
I was just wondering, I was in Utøya in 2013, and also I visited the labor youth camp where they held it then, and talked to some of the survivors there. And I remember they were very concerned about getting back as fast as possible because they were so afraid they would lose the connection, the overlap between generations. And I was just curious if this urgency of speed they felt, how much that influenced the urgency of speed you felt, and how much that influenced the way it was you did all this so quickly.
Well, the urgency, which you describe in a precise way, it certainly had an impact of the first approaches that the labor youth had to getting back, because they did rush things, and that became a very problematic thing, getting everything into a deadlock and a very complicated situation with the families I do think that they do believe, and I do think it's maybe correct also, that they sense that if they didn't get back within a certain time span, the island would be lost to them, because there would be some transition figures that could, the link, the 70 years link would be broken in a way. But I do feel that when they invited us in, they had at that time realized that this will take time, and we need to do it right, and it will take as much time as it takes, the camps. They had this first camp in 2015, a smaller version, and then in 2016, 5 years after the terror attacks, they were back, when this protective building and the spaces of memory was opened. So time was of essence, but I do think that their sense of time changed a lot throughout that period. Their rush in the first year did change, and they decided to move much more slowly after a while.
Yeah. No, I think it was. I mean, it needed that time, and I think that the speed, at least from Utøya, where you have been more working with than me, was the time they actually needed. I mean, we all needed it to find a good solution, and they needed it to sort of get back there in a proper way.
Well, as you can see, there's so much to say. It really, just an extraordinary project, and for those who have the opportunity, it's well worth taking to go to Oslo and see it, and it's a beautiful city anyway. But it really fits very well into the context of daily life there, and the students are going, and it now is integrating this terrible chapter into the longer history of the country. It's been wonderful to have you, gentlemen. Thank you so much. I would like to invite you all, courtesy of the Norwegian consulate, to a little reception outside. But please join me first in thanking Atle Aas and Tor Einar Fagerland.